The 15th chapter of Luke, Luke chapter 15, and I want to begin reading in verse 11. I've titled the message this morning, A Beautiful Homecoming. And so beginning in verse 11, would you follow with me? Jesus said, a certain man had two sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided of them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he'd spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, he said, How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. And he arose and came to his father, but when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him, and had compassion on him, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. But the father said to his servants, Bring forth the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. Bring hither the fatted calf and kill it. Let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. The parable of the prodigal son could well be described as likened to a stage play with 4 different acts. And between these 4 acts, 2 that are on one side of the intermission and 2 on the other. We go from sorrow to great happiness. It is the story of a beautiful homecoming. And so we want to begin this morning with Act 1 of what seems to be likened to Jesus directing a stage play that could be an example of real life. And in Act 1, we will call that particular scene a scene of rebellion. I want you to picture with me this morning a very, very beautiful house. And this house has as its head a really good, faithful man. A man who loves his family. He is a rather wealthy man and will provide for his family as much as he possibly can. He wants them to be happy, but he also understands the importance of order and right doing. And therefore, while he is a loving father, he is a father who is going to be the head of his house, and things will be done his way because he looks after the best interest of his family, and it is his God-given right to be the head of his house. In this house, you have one boy who begrudgingly serves his father. He not only is obedient to the things that take place inside the house, he's evidently a hard worker and will go out and till the soil and help grow the crops. There is another boy, however, who is very resentful of his father and his way of life at home. He wants out. He is just thinking that there has to be something out there that's better than this house. He does not take into his thinking how important it is to have the security of that home. He doesn't seem to understand that his dad provides for him, and not only that, is guiding him in the right direction. No, he just wants out. Let me say this. Any young person who grows up in a good and godly home who is always wanting out because there must be something better outside this household, that person already has a heart of rebellion. What we find here in Luke 15 is a young man that really had everything a young man should want. And for that reason, it ought to cause him not only to be thankful to his Father, but to the God of heaven. But instead, he chooses to rebel. He's got to get out. And so in verse 12 of Luke 15, this younger son says to his father, "Give me the portion of goods that's mine." He's wanting his inheritance, and he wants it right then. He's really saying to his father, "I wish you were dead so I can have my inheritance. But since you are not dead, you go ahead and give that to me now." Now think about this. The rebel always says, whatever it is I want it right now. I'm not going to wait. And so he demands of his father, "Give me mine inheritance." You want to see the language of a rebel? Just notice it here in Luke 15. The rebel says, "Give me." He never says, "Use me." He never says, "Take me." He never says, "Make me." It's always, "Give to me." And so, here is this young man who wants to go somewhere. He's not exactly sure where that is, but it's called the far country. And he's heard wonderful things about this place called the far country. I mean, he hears about it on television. He sees it in the movies. He studies about it on the internet. There's this place out there where once you're away from home, you can do your own thing. Oh, it's shiny and bright and glamorous. And if I can just get out of this house, away from these rules and regulations, despite all the blessings, I will have it made. I want to tell you something. You don't have to go very far to go to the far country, all right? No. You don't have to go very far to go to the far country. But this young man says, there's this place called the far country. That's where I'm going. That's where I can live it up. That's where I can see my dreams fulfilled. But the problem, you see, with this young man is not a problem of distance getting to the far country. It's a problem with his heart. His heart is far away from his father. His heart is already far away from home. His heart is far away from right doing. You see, he's influenced, no doubt, by certain friends who have also found out about the far country. The music that he finds the most appealing is that which speaks about the far country. He lives in an age where everybody's scoffing at their parents, and therefore the right thing is just to get out of the house. Church has become just a bore. You know, when you're about 11 or 12 and 13, mom and dad would finally let you hang out as long as it was at church, right? But now we're getting older, and I understand the other things that's going on out there in the world, and I want to be a part of it. If that's your thinking, you see, young person, you're already on your way to the far country. This is a picture in scene 1 of this particular play that Jesus is directing. It is called Rebellion. And I want you to notice something else when you look at Luke 15 about this rebellious boy. Something that happens when you get to this particular point. You don't care about anybody else. He had a father who loved him, but he didn't care about him. He didn't care about breaking his father's heart. He just wanted to do his own thing. It mattered not to this boy that once he was away from home, his parents couldn't sleep at night. Oh no. As long as he was able to make it to the far country, that's all that mattered to him. Leave your responsibilities behind. Doesn't make any difference how much debt you have accumulated. Let somebody else take care of that. For some, if they already have children, let somebody else take care of them. That's a common practice in our society today. I'm not going to take responsibility for it because I've got to go out and I've got to find myself. And where do you find yourself? Out in the far country that we've been hearing about. The first scene, the first act, is rebellion. And so verse 13, he goes on his way. And I notice something here. The father doesn't stop him. He's finally reached this age where the father can't stop him. The father, though his heart is breaking and his lips are quivering and tears may be streaming down his face, says, go ahead and do what you want to do. And so this young man, the father knows, is determined. I want to tell you, friends, when you've got a determined rebel on your hands, it's hard to stop that rebel. And so the father would have to let that determined son go ahead and go to the far country. Now I want to tell you something. If you're determined to go to the far country, you can go there. You're going to resist everybody that tries to keep you away from the far country, but you'll break loose and you'll go. And so it is that our Father in heaven will allow you to do whatever it is you're determined to do if you're determined to go to the far country. You see, God will even allow one to become so distorted in his thinking to go to hell if that's what the person is determined to do. He allows that. This is a picture of rebellion. And how sad it is when one sets out for the far country failing to listen to God. But every generation, it seems, there are those who have the idea that somehow God's law of sowing and reaping doesn't apply to us. It doesn't apply. You reap what you sow. That was for former generations, but that's not going to happen to me. But the law of sowing and reaping is set by God, and it will not be violated. It will always come to pass in our lives. But we go to the next act. Act 2 is a scene of revelry. In verse 13 again, not many days after, the young man gathered all together, took his journey to the far country. Now notice this. There he wasted his substance with riotous living. What's he doing now? He's having fun. He's now living it up. He's finally made it, and so far it seems like he's made the right decision. Because he has plenty of money, and nobody trying to tell him what to do. He's now on the road to the far country, and he can see the billboards, and everything about these billboards about the far country says that whatever you want, you get. It's everything that appeals to the flesh. That's what he's seeing. So it is, once I can get to the far country, I can enjoy all that life has to offer. And one thing he found as he's traveling to the far country, that on that road there are a whole lot of people traveling with him. Plenty of friends on the road to the far country, friends so-called. And they seem so loving. They're so tolerant of everything that he's doing. Is he having a good time? Oh, yes. He changes his hairstyle. He gets new clothes. He comes to this way of thinking. Nothing's absolutely right. Nothing's absolutely wrong. Whatever you want to do when you get to the far country. You see, the devil's smart. He knows how to get you to the far country by enticing you with some bait that looks so desirable. If the devil truly showed you the end result of sin, you wouldn't want to go there. Oh, so he uses what power he has to to allure you and to cause you to be trapped. And so through the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, he pulls at you. But it's interesting to me that once in that far country, while he's living it up and having a good time for a while, that eventually that good time would come to an end. Because the text says he wasted his substance on riotous living. You see, this young man knows nothing at all how to make money. He just knows how to spend it. And after a while, the money will be gone. Wasted his... You know what that means? He blew it all. I used to hear my parents and other adults talk about someone who had received a lot of money, and then before the conversation was over, you heard someone say, and then he blew it. Blew it all. Wasted it. And that's what this young man does once he gets to the far country. You see, he's engaged in partying and in revelry, and now he is running out of money. And when you run out of money, you know what else you'll find happen? You'll run out of friends. He had plenty of friends as long as he was paying for the party. But then when the party was over, he had no more money. He was just a bum. And they didn't care anything at all for him. So here he was in the far country. Everything had been going just as he wanted it to go as long as he had money. He bought everything that was in sight. He lived any way he wanted to live, fulfilling the lusts and the desires of the flesh. But then one day he found that the money ran out. And right at this particular point, we take an intermission, a break. It's all looked good up to this point for the young man, but now it's changing. And as the third act opens, we could call this third act remorse. Because all of a sudden, when the money runs out, he can no longer pay the rent. That fancy car he got's been repossessed. And no longer can he pay for the party. No one wants to help him out. Isn't it interesting, because this is the boy who always criticized his daddy, that his daddy didn't really care for him. This is the one who would always say, all those church members, they just do-gooders. This is the one who always, who always rejected rules, not understanding their purpose. I want to be with the people who love me for just as I am. I want to be with the people who let me do my own thing. But now all of a sudden, he can't pay his bills, and they're nowhere around. You'll find out very quickly that once you get in trouble out in this old world doesn't care. It doesn't. And so he's lost his friends. You know, when you think about losing your friends, that's really a picture of hell, because in hell you have no friends. None. He's in a country where nobody cares about him. This is the place he now has to admit where all of his troubles began. It is here in the far country that his grief and his sorrow and his heartache began. It is here that he began to have remorse over what had taken place. This wasn't supposed to happen to him, was it? This was not the plan. What was not the plan? To be where he is now. For the text says in verse 14, when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. No, he was supposed to live it up in the far country. But now he's in want. Now he needs help. You see, sin took him farther than he ever wanted to go. It kept him longer than he ever wanted to stay, cost him more than he ever wanted to pay. This young man, who really had it all, has now been broken. Satan, you see, is never satisfied until he drags a person through the depths of despair and utterly destroys that person. And that was the goal of the devil all along. That's why the road to the far country seems so appealing. The devil made it that way, to get you to travel that road. And now where is he? Notice the next few verses. He went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. Was that man who sent him to the pig pen a nice man? No, he didn't care anything about him. He said, I guess you can go out there and feed the pigs. I don't have anything for you, and I don't care. So now he's in a pig pen. This young man who had everything in his father's house is now in a pig pen. Let that sink in. He would love to have the food the pigs eat because he's hungry. And it represents one who has found himself in sin, and sin perhaps is the greatest form of insanity of all. It is addictive. It is likened to slavery. This boy wasn't supposed to live like this. His father had other plans for him. They were plans where he would do well. They were noble goals that this father had set for this particular boy. It was supposed to be different, but here he is, lost in a pig pen. And then this scene closes. And this scene closes, it's not a beautiful sight. We have to desire another act in Jesus' play that he's directing. And there is. The final act is one that we will call return. Look at verse 17. When he came to himself, he said, how many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? Did you notice that line, when he came to himself? He's not been thinking properly, has he? And those who are entangled in sin, that's the problem. They're not thinking. Not thinking. You see, some of you in here this morning, you could be on your way to the far country, and you don't want to hear this. You say, well, I can think for myself. No, that's the problem. You won't think. And as soon as a preacher starts talking about these things and the dangers of the far country, what do? Time to get on my phone. It's time to let me start thinking about something else. You don't want to think about what I'm talking about. For what reason? Give yourself just a few minutes to think about it, and you'll get right with God. You see, it's not in man that walketh to direct his own steps, Jeremiah 10:23. You allow yourself to be diverted. For what reason? You don't want to think. The person who rejects Christianity and the goals that Christ has for one's life, that person doesn't think. But now in the pig pen, and sometimes that's what it takes. And sometimes that doesn't even work. But here is a man in the pig pen. He says, this isn't right. I wasn't made for this. I can do better. I had it better at home. What am I going to do? The only thing I can do is go home to my father. And he says, I tell you, when I get home, I know I can't be his son anymore. That wouldn't be right. He says, when I get home, I'm going to say to my father, listen to this, make me a servant. Oh, he's changed, hasn't he? He's no longer the rebel, he's the penitent. Make me a servant. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Just allow me to be one of your hired hands. That's good enough. Well, now he's thinking right. Remember in Mark 5, Jesus healed a man who had multiple demons. And when Jesus brought out those demons, the text says the man was sitting and clothed in his right mind. Well, here's a young man in a pig pen, but he's come to his senses, and he heads out. He says, I'm going home. Now, there's something about this young man that he didn't realize. And here's the beautiful homecoming. He didn't realize that while he was away in the far country, there was not a day that went by that his father didn't think about him. He didn't realize how many tears his father had shed over his departure, how many prayers had been offered. And so he's thinking in his mind, I'm going to go home to my father and hope for the best because I know my father hates me now. Did his father hate him? No. You see, this boy didn't know that every day that father, after he'd worked the fields, would probably wipe his brow of the sweat and look out on the horizon and think, maybe this is the day. Maybe this is the day my lost boy will be found. Maybe this is the day I'll see him coming home. And one day it happened. It was a figure a long way off in the distance. Most people wouldn't have recognized the figure, but a parent would. The father drops his tools. Where's the old man going? We haven't seen him run like this in years. What's going on? Because the text says, when the father saw him, he ran to meet him. The only picture in all of the Bible that you have a picture of God running, and he's running to meet his son. And when they meet, the father does the unthinkable. He begins to embrace him. And tears of joy are now flowing down his cheeks. And he kisses his son. I want to tell you, it has to be very, very special when fathers and son kiss, right? But it happens. It can happen. He begins to kiss his son. And then his son starts thinking, now it's the time for me to give my speech. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. And this father here says, go get a robe and put around him. But Father, let me explain my situation. Go put some shoes on his feet. Dad, you don't know what all I've done. It's terrible, and I know I don't deserve to be called your son. Oh, put that ring back on his finger again. Go kill the fatted calf. How could this be possible? The father says, this is my son. He was dead, and he's alive again. He was lost, and he's found. It indeed, my friends, is the most beautiful picture in all the Bible. And it's likened to a play that Jesus directed. But then Jesus says, this is real. This is a picture, Jesus says, of your Father in heaven who's longing to welcome his lost child back home. There's a movie that came out many, many years ago before I was ever born, and yet I have enjoyed watching this movie through the years. It's called Imitation of Life, and it stars a wonderful African-American actress by the name of Juanita Moore. Juanita Moore played the role of Annie Johnson, who worked for a movie actress by the name of Laura Meredith, who was played by the veteran Hollywood actress Lana Turner. And Annie Johnson had a biracial daughter. And Annie Johnson's daughter despised her, didn't want anything to do with her. And Annie Johnson was a godly soul. She loved that girl with all of her heart. And that girl in that movie, Imitation of Life, decided she'd travel to the far country, and she didn't want anybody to know anything about her background, and she certainly didn't want anybody to know who her mother was. And after trying to reach her so many times and only being told to go away, Annie Johnson, who typically would never have entered a nightclub, entered a nightclub one evening because she found out that's where her daughter was working. She waited for her daughter in the dressing room. And her daughter again scoffed at her and mocked her and says, "Why won't you leave me alone?" And Annie Johnson said, "I'm going to leave you alone." She says, "You're never going to hear from me anymore." She said, "Only one request. Let me hug you one more time." And her daughter allowed her to hug her. And they embraced. And oh, it was an embrace that brought tears to that daughter's eyes, though she would not show that to her mother. And Annie Johnson went on her way, never to see her daughter again. But then Annie Johnson, as she was on her deathbed, told Miss Laura Meredith, the lady for whom she worked and whom she had developed a wonderful relationship. She said, "You'll find over there in my dresser, in the drawer, the details for my funeral." And once she passed away, oh, what a funeral was held for Annie Johnson. I mean, it was likened to a parade, and there was a marching band, and there were flowers, and there were horse-drawn caissons, and glass-enclosed caisson, there was the flower-draped coffin of Annie Johnson. And all of a sudden, busting through the crowd was none other than her daughter, Sarah Jane. And she rushes to that caisson, causes the whole parade to stop. She opens up those doors and she falls out on that coffin and she says, "Oh, Mama, I'm so sorry." And Miss Laura Meredith, for whom Annie Johnson had worked, got out of her car quickly and went over and put her arms around Sarah Jane and said, "Sarah Jane, don't do this. Don't do it." In other words, it's too late. It's too late. Friends, we don't ever want to wait too long to get right with the Father. Here's the problem. When you make the spiritual application, it's not the Father who dies, we do. And you don't want to wait too long before you've reconciled with the Father who loves you so much, has so many noble goals and plans for your life. If only you listen to Him and follow Him. And if you're thinking about the far country you've already been, He's saying, "Come home." Art Linkletter was a well-known radio and television personality. People have long appreciated Art Linkletter for his family-oriented entertainment. During the 1960s, when so many young people were going astray and taking drugs and doing other things that were harmful, Art Linkletter was one very concerned about the youth of that generation. He composed a letter. In today's language, it went viral. It was a letter that spoke of the love of a mother and father for a lost child, one who'd gone astray. And I wished I had time to read the entire letter because it's beautiful as it illustrates so clearly the heart of parents for a child who's left home and who's not in contact. And these parents are aching over the child. And finally, in that last paragraph, Art Linkletter says, "I went into your room tonight. It's empty. It seemed that the very walls We're crying out for your embrace. But I even more. He says, come home. If you're reading this letter, he says, come home. We love you. Call collect. Now, to those of you who are younger, you may not understand what that means. But there was a time when we didn't have mobile devices. And parents might say to their children, say, now look, you may not can afford to call home. You just call collect. And what that meant was this: when you call collect, the parents say, we're paying for it. We're accepting the charges. Go ahead and reverse the charges. Just call us and call collect if you have to. I want to tell you something, friends. The cross of Calvary is the God of heaven saying to every one of us, call collect. Call collect. Reverse the charges. I'm paying for them. Just come home. May every one of us in this audience this morning decide within our minds and our hearts, above everything else, we want to be at home in our Father's house. And one who has wandered away from God can come back home either as a penitent believer who needs to be baptized so that he can become a Christian, or either be restored by traveling the path of repentance that leads home. You can do it. On this side of eternity, you still have God crying out, come home, call collect. I love you. Think about that. Let's stand and sing.